Hello, and welcome to the My Heart and Mind podcast, where it's all about creating the feel-good mindset so you can make the most of every moment and reap the benefits of getting the most happiness out of life. And now, over to your host, Sally Crawley.
My show is for you if you've had a heart attack, heart surgery, a cardiac arrest, or your life has been impacted by a cardiac diagnosis. It's all about mastering your thoughts and feelings and emotions so you can feel great and live a life that you love despite your diagnosis. Thank you so much for joining me today. Just before we get into the show though, please be aware that my work is not intended to replace conventional medicine. It is complementary. If you have any concerns about your health or your heart, then do seek medical expert advice immediately. Hello, I hope you're doing well today, my hearty friend. This week's episode is about nutrition, and my guest is Cheryl Strachan of Sweet Spot Nutrition. She's a registered dietitian specialising in cardiac nutrition and wellness. Her mission is to share her love for food that hits the sweet spot. She's also an author of 3 recipe books. Cheryl believes that we should be eating for health gain that will naturally lead to weight loss. Today we talk about her involvement in the cardiac rehab world in Calgary and how she developed her model, the Sweet Spot. We have a great discussion about moderation and what it actually means in real life. We chat about how what you eat can reduce fatigue and talk about mood foods too. If you want to hear her thoughts on chocolate, coffee and wine, then stay tuned. Hi, hello and welcome to the show, Cheryl. It is so lovely to have you here. I came across you on Facebook and I was riveted by what I've read. So today I'd like you to introduce yourself to our listeners and tell us a little bit about your start in life and where you are and how you got to where you are now.
Sounds good. Thanks. And thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here. I'm Cheryl Strachan. I'm a registered dietitian in Canada. And it wasn't actually my first career. I worked for about 10 years in sales and marketing, but kind of always gravitated to the things that involve sort of helping people and fixing problems. So had some freedom at 32, actually went back to school, was able to go back and become a dietitian. And my first real full-time job was with the cardiac rehab program here in Calgary, Canada. And I've worked in that field basically ever since, 17 years. That was 2005, I think that's 17. And I love cardiac rehab. As a dietitian, it's super rewarding to work with people who they're in that place where they really want to make a change, right? So really enjoyed working with the people over the years. And in 2014, I left there to do a private practice just because I wanted to go beyond what we can do in public health. Mm-hmm. So, get a little deeper, give people more resources. Although I have had a foot in the door there, I still go back when they need extra help. So I work sort of off and on and more for them during the pandemic recently. But now my private practice is kind of dedicated to cardiac rehab type work, more longer term. Usually the cardiac rehab programs go for 12 weeks and people get past that stage of being afraid of food and really overwhelmed and anxious. And they start to think, okay, I've got this. And then sort of their life goes back a little bit more to normal and the old habits come back and they realize, oh, there's more to this than maybe I realized, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. We in the UK have a cardiac rehab program, which again is 12 weeks. How much in Canada is actually covered by nutrition? I mean, I'll be honest and say from my memory, because it was a while ago, that we only had one short session about nutrition. Is that the same in Canada?
I think it varies across programs. So I can just speak to the program here in Calgary. And when I first started in 2005, it was almost still experimental, right? If you go way back 20, 30 years, it was kind of radical to have people exercise after a heart attack. They would more do like bed rest. And so at the time when I joined, it was still something that was kind of new and novel. And they really tried to make it everything they could. So when I first joined, I think we had 7 nutrition classes. Excellent. 2 dietitians. We had a social worker, a psychologist, 12 weeks of exercise. It was quite a robust program. And that was great. The nutrition classes were all optional, but the people who chose to come to all of them, you could really get that, you could see them make that transition and start to feel more confidence and understand, what to do. And the neat thing was they would make connections with each other too during all the classes and exercise sessions. But with, I would say about 2012 or so, with budget cuts, this went back down to having just one nutrition class, which sounds like more what your experience was.
Okay.
So 1 2-hour nutrition class. And then, of course, in 2020, we lost that too, at least the live in-person class. And so for a while, it was written material. And then now there's a short video people can watch. But it's not the same, right?
No. Hopefully we'll get to a blended hybrid where it's a bit in person and a bit
we're
video.
not. We're just starting back exercise in person now, but for shorter term so that they don't have as many people every session, so it's safer. But we don't have any in-person nutrition yet.
Okay. So you mentioned your private practice. Was that focused particularly on cardio patients and nutrition, or were you working with everybody? And how did you get to where you are now?
The private practice is focused on people with heart concerns, although it's not necessarily people who've had a heart event. There's a lot of prevention as well. So if someone has, say, a new diagnosis of diabetes or pre-diabetes or high blood pressure, high cholesterol, something that might put them more at risk for a heart event, then I often work with those people now as well.
Oh, that's brilliant, because prevention is actually one of the keys, isn't it? It's like after the horse has bolted a bit.
Yes, and that is one thing when you're working in cardiac rehab, you think, gosh, I should work more in prevention. And people say, gosh, if I had known all of this, right? Gee, they should teach this in school.
Yeah.
But we as humans, we're more tuned into something when it's a crisis, when it's really urgent. Otherwise, there's more urgent things in people's lives.
Yeah, it really starts the motivation going. So one of the things that really interested me was when obviously I said about the Facebook page, was I was looking and you have the sweet spot approach, and I will post some images because you've got a lovely visual which I can't obviously show on a podcast, but it includes all the main factors. But most of all, it's that person's sweet spot. So could you share with us, tell me all about it? How does it work? How does it benefit?
Sure. And I'll tell you, it comes from my husband, who said at some point, before I met you, there was either healthy food or food that I wanted to eat, food that I liked. And those were sort of two separate things. And he had this observation, which as a dietitian, I thought, this is normal. Like, we can make healthy food taste good. But for him, and I think many people, it was like one or the other, healthy or tastes good. And he said, actually, you've got this sweet spot, this overlap between food that's good for you and also I like it. So we kind of built on that. And the other piece I built in, and if you share the visual, people will see it's like a Venn diagram with 3 circles. Because after giving it some thought, I thought, there's this whole other aspect of making decisions about food that's really unique to each person. And that's why it's called right for you. Things like your budget, which for some people is more of a consideration, or your time, how much time you have, or energy for cooking, right? If you're too tired, that's a factor as well. So each person is going to have a different overlap there of foods that they like, that support their unique health situation, and that also work for them in other ways that matter to them.
So your program, is it unique for each individual, but framed around the model that you have?
I'm working with people to find their own, to support them in finding their own sweet spot. So I don't say give out meal plans, for example, because I find that works for people in the, 2 or 3 weeks, but then in the long run, they need to figure out their own sweet spot.
A long time ago, I found that one of the things for me was about the key staples that I had in my pantry. And I did a bit of analysis and realised that there's some really rubbish stuff there that are your go-tos. And again, that's something that you talk about in your community group on Facebook, which I thought was fascinating. One of the other things, that I think I hear a lot in conversations within hearty groups, etc., is this thing about moderation. And that's one of the reasons I think this Venn diagram works really well, because it's that what you like, isn't it? But moderation, you can't put it in a wheelbarrow and say, this is what moderation looks like. So how would you describe it?
Well, it depends on how analytical a person is. When I'm working with someone, I would say on a simple general level, if you think 80-20, if about 80% of what you're eating is there to really support your health, And maybe 20% is there for another perfectly good reason, whether it's just food that you really enjoy or it connects you with others. You go for an ice cream with your niece, that's food for joy. That's another good reason. Or sometimes there's just food for convenience because you're running and you've got a meeting and you're going to have to grab a slice of pizza because that's the only thing you've got handy. But if 80% is sort of supporting your health, you're doing pretty well. So that's, and of course, I'm not talking about literally calculating 80%, but just the ballpark. If you think about that as a rule of thumb, that's a good place to start. And some of my clients really want to get a little more granular. And so sometimes we'll look at things, whatever is important to them, say sodium for some people is trying to figure out how much sodium is too much, right? And the guidelines vary, but they're all around 2,000 milligrams a day. So I often like to translate that into about 500 a meal as a rule of thumb. And of course, some of your meals will be a little more and some will be a little less. But if, you go out to a restaurant meal, you can easily get a meal with, 2,100 milligrams of sodium on one plate of food. That is very commonplace in restaurants. And so if you compare that to 500 per meal, that's not moderation.
Yes,
right?
absolutely.
In your home kitchen, you can make something quite tasty that's 600-700 milligrams. And it's like, okay, that's a little more than my 500, but you've got some wiggle room. If you're doing 500 at every meal, that gives you some wiggle room for snacks and some meals being a little higher, some a little lower. So sometimes I'll have people look at labels or even write down what they're eating for just a few days, just to start getting a sense. Okay, this is a little bit of sodium. It's no big deal. Okay, this is a lot. This is probably not something I should have too often.
Yeah. Because it's actually being able to visualize it as well, isn't it? Because, and getting used to what has high content or not.
Right. And sometimes there are surprises in doing that. People realize a pickle. Oh, there's a lot of sodium in a pickle, right? We didn't know that. But often we find people do that exercise where they'll write down what they eat and we'll put our heads together and figure out how much sodium was that? Oh, it's only 1,400. And they'll think, gee, I had a piece of ham. I thought that was off limits. Well, in the context of an overall low sodium day, one piece of ham is not the end of the world. Of course, it's not your heart healthiest food, but it's the big picture that matters, right?
Absolutely. That brings me nicely on to after a heart attack, a lot of people they feel like they're expected to lose weight. And one of the downsides of being on some of the heart medications is it's really tough to lose weight. But there's a difference, isn't there? You can be slim and still be heart unhealthy, or you can be slightly on the heavier side and have a really heart healthy diet. So can you kind of explain what that is for us?
Absolutely. I would say this is one of the reasons I also went into private practice, so I could practice more from what we call a weight inclusive approach, which means, we welcome and respect and support people of all sizes and shapes, but also our work is more around health gained than weight lost. And the evidence really supports that. We don't have a lot of good evidence that weight loss in the long run improves heart health. In fact, one of the most robust studies that was designed to answer this question found that it didn't help. It was a study called the Look Ahead, and I can give you the link if you like for your show notes.
Yeah, that would be brilliant.
And it was people with diabetes, but in the Look Ahead study, they were given an intensive intervention and they were able to lose 7 to 8% of their body weight, which is actually quite significant. It doesn't sound like much, but it takes a lot to do that. They threw everything at them, tons of support. And after 7-8 years, they found, hey, you know what? People aren't having fewer heart attacks. They aren't having fewer heart events. They aren't living longer in this intervention group. And so they discontinued the study actually earlier than planned. And in contrast, we have lots of studies that show that what you do makes a difference more than what you weigh. So for example, the Mediterranean diet, we have 2 good studies that show Mediterranean diet reduces cardiac events. And these are intervention, high quality trials. Same thing with exercise. We have good evidence when people exercise more, cardiovascular fitness improves, they live longer, right? We don't really have that for weight loss. We see improvements in the short run for sure in the markers of health. So things like blood sugar, cholesterol, triglycerides get better, but weight loss doesn't tend to last for the vast majority of people. Our bodies really fight to get back to that original weight. Sometimes it's called the set weight.
Right. It's a bit like homeostasis.
Sorry, I was going to say it's another example of homeostasis. Yeah, exactly. Just like we want to keep our pH in our blood at a certain level, the body tends to want to go back to that higher weight. And when people lose weight, they report, food tastes better. They think about food more often. So the body's got all these very complex mechanisms to make sure you don't starve to death, right? Because that's been one of the greatest threats to survival. So it's quite difficult, at least from diet and exercise, to lose weight. We have some interesting newer medications that are doing, better. So there'll be some promise there. But, just focusing on weight loss, I think, is really counterproductive. It sets people up for failure.
Absolutely.
Right?
And we want
Remember
people
once someone in cardiac rehab. Yes, I know. And someone said to me once in cardiac rehab, he said, cardiac rehab didn't work for me. I failed. And I was unpacking that. Like, what do you mean by that? And we looked at his stress test, and he had done better on his 12-week versus his initial stress test, which means you're more fit and you have a better chance of not having another event. But for him, it was all about the weight loss, right? Because I didn't lose the weight that I thought I should lose, I failed. So I think we failed someone like that, because we need to make sure they understand it's much more than what you weigh. That's not a great indicator of health, actually.
And that brings in the emotional side of it, isn't it? Because when you're feeling unhappy and miserable, you just want to eat things that make you feel good. And we have neurons in our brains that actually want us to eat certain foods because they're good for us, but in moderation. And then we get this vicious circle. So do you work with people over the emotional side of eating their feelings down, that kind of thing?
Oh, of course. It's so common, and especially since the pandemic, especially the first few months of the pandemic, it seemed like that was what everybody was talking about. Because we do, in response to emotions like stress, anxiety, depression, which are common in people with heart disease, that is a natural response, is to eat sort of those higher fat, higher sugar, more satiating foods. And they do provide some relief from those emotions. Like, there's something to that idea of comfort food. So for sure, that's something we work with quite a bit. Yeah.
So fatigue is something that I've been talking about on my podcast. And I wondered whether you had any food tips or ideas about how people can manage fatigue, because I think it goes hand in hand with a cardiac. I know you've talked about preventative and everything, but most of the people that are listening potentially have had a cardiac event, and it takes forever, it feels, to work through the fatigue. So if anything you could share with us would be brilliant.
Absolutely. Yeah. Because it's so common in people with heart disease, that's a big part of my practice. Although, as a side note, I do a lunchtime talk, which back before the pandemic, I used to go to workplaces. And that also was my most popular lunchtime talk. I think a lot of people experience fatigue, but for sure, it's much more exhausting and debilitating after a heart event for lots of people. So basically, some of the key things are, number one, make sure to feed yourself.
Yes.
So kind of back to basics, but making sure you're getting those 3 balanced meals a day. And for many people, a little snack, and especially in the afternoon, if you're eating sometime around noon and you're not eating supper until 7, 8 p.m., that's a very long stretch to go. So 3 balanced meals, plus if you're more than 4 or 5 hours between meals, a nice, healthy, balanced snack. And that's just to start, of course, making sure you're well fed. And those balanced meals, what I mean by that is the 3 components, right? Protein, carbs, fruit or vegetables. And they all have a really important role to play in making sure you have enough energy. And as we like to say, it's necessary, but not always sufficient, right? There's much more going on between your medications and damage to your heart and possibly other health conditions like sleep apnea or anything, anemia, etc. But that foundation of at least getting those 3 good meals a day is the place to start, and making sure there's enough food there. So again, that strict dieting, which it might work in the short run, but tends to not really work in the long run anyways, it can sap your energy if you're not having enough food to eat. Or if it's just on a one-day basis where someone, misses breakfast because they're running late and then they don't have time for lunch. And then by supper, there's the energy, it's kind of gone, and the hunger is huge. Of course, then you have a very big meal and you feel like you just want to lay on the couch, right? So trying to get those 3 meals and staying hydrated, of course. So getting enough fluids. And I always like to say it's okay to drink a bit of coffee if you like that. We have good evidence that coffee does bump up our alertness. It's not for everyone, of course. Like some people, it will trigger more atrial fibrillation. So that's something, if you're having problems with that, you might try cutting out coffee. But for most people, moderate amounts of coffee or caffeine-containing beverages are fine. So that can help if you need a little boost in the morning. That's okay to do.
That's good for me.
But I'm not as keen on alcohol, especially if someone's fatigued. We know alcohol is a depressant and it interferes with quality sleep. So maybe a little bit of wine, the 1 to 2 glasses a day kind of thing, more like 1 for women and 2 for men, is okay. But if you're finding you're really dragging the next day, taking that alcohol out of the picture might improve the sleep quality, which might help with that fatigue. What else? Mood boosting foods. I always like to tie mood with fatigue. That feeling you have when you're kind of down and sad.
Yes.
It makes you feel less motivated, and that fatigue, it kind of compounds it, right? So mood boosting foods are worth a try. The evidence is kind of mixed. Say, for example, fish. We have some evidence that fish helps with low mood, depressed states. It's not a replacement for sure for medication and other treatments. But some studies show fish can improve, especially the oily fatty fish, which is rich in omega-3 fats. The supplements, maybe not. I would definitely talk to a doctor before taking any supplements. The other interesting strategy for mood and energy is a lower glycemic load diet. So I thought we might just spend a couple of minutes talking about what that is, unpacking that.
Yeah, that'd be brilliant.
It's also very good for heart health. So I love when something is like, oh, that's good for mood, which is good for energy and also heart health. So a glycemic load is basically looking at the concept of glycemic index, which tells us how fast does a particular food make my blood sugar go up. So if you think of something like white bread or white potatoes, they have a high glycemic index and they make our blood sugar go up fast. A high glycemic load diet is when you're eating a lot of those foods. So it's those foods in large amounts frequently. And a high glycemic load diet in one very high quality study, an intervention randomized clinical trial, showed that the people on the higher glycemic load diet had more depressive symptoms, more what the researchers called total mood disturbance, and also more fatigue / inertia was the measure they took. They had people answer questionnaires. So I try to help people get on a lower glycemic load diet because it's good for heart health and quite possibly good for mood too. So that's more like smaller portion sizes for our carbs. Any kind of starchy food like pasta, potatoes, rice, just making a fist. That's about the amount we're aiming for at every meal. And then making sure you've got lots of vegetables and protein foods and other things on the plate so you're not hungry. I don't want to leave people hungry. But just keeping that carb-rich food to about that fist-size serving. And then choosing more of the lower glycemic index foods, which you can find lists online. But basically, it's things like beans and lentils and dried peas, things like quinoa, barley, bulgur, and other whole grains. The oats that take longer to cook, right? Your more steel-cut oats versus, say, instant oats. Certain kinds of bread, like sprouted grains, for example, or mixed whole grains. If you get like a good whole grain, 12-grain bread, those are all going to make your blood sugar go up much more slowly and not quite go as high. And help you feel more full and satiating, and it's better for energy too. So that's kind of one of the other strategies. And then the last one for mood boosting that I always think is fun to talk about is chocolate.
Oh, talk away.
I know. It's, there is some evidence that chocolate is a little bit of a mood booster. Take it with a grain of salt. Some of it is funded by the chocolate industry, but, in small amounts, especially the darker types of chocolate, there's also some evidence for heart health. So, this is where I'm a little bit different than some of the guidance you'll get from the big organizations, is that I try to be practical. I know people like chocolate. And if it's something we can work in small amounts to help us kind of feel better and enjoy the way that we're eating, that's going to be more sustainable in the long run anyhow.
Well, I love ending up on chocolate. And I've never been a fan of milk chocolate anyway, so the darker kind is my favourite.
Isn't that true? Me too. I really don't like the milk, but it's an acquired taste, right? The dark chocolate.
It is.
Some people don't like it. And the evidence isn't so strong that I would say you must eat dark chocolate even if you hate it. It's one of those things that might help. Doesn't seem to hurt. It's lower in sugar. So if you like it, great. There's something else you can add to your plate.
Absolutely. Well, it's been fantastic talking to you and hearing that I can have a glass of wine and coffee and all the things that people think that you can't have. But it goes back to that original conversation around the moderation.
Yeah. Are there any others that, in terms of moderation, that you're kind of wondering how much alcohol, how much coffee, any of the other things for moderation?
Red meat is something I think that comes up. There's a lot of people that are very plant-based diets in the cardiac recovery. Where do you sit on that?
Oh, that's such a good question. I get that one all the time. I live in Alberta, Canada, which is where we make a lot of beef here.
Yes.
We produce a lot of beef, and lots of people love to eat beef, would eat it every day, prior to their heart event. So they come in, do I have to eliminate this food completely? Is it, and the evidence is not strong that you do. There's some evidence, but it's, those Mediterranean diet studies that I talked about. In the Mediterranean diet, they certainly eat less red meat than we do in our typical Western cultures. And it depends, it varies by the study. But, the most recent, the biggest one I can think of is the PREDIMED study, where they actually were looking at people having less than 100 grams a day of red meat, which still seems like kind of a lot to me, actually. Some people sure eat more than that, but it's not a zero amount of red meat. And some Mediterranean studies looked at more like 12 ounces a month.
No.
Sorry, I did my training in the US, so I skip between ounces and grams. Hopefully it's easy enough for people to follow. But, that's about 4, good size servings of red meat a month. So it's not a zero amount with the Mediterranean diet. There have been some studies for sure in completely plant-based diets. Dr. Dean Ornish, for example, in the 90s did one. Where there was a little bit of skim milk, egg whites, but for the most part, it was completely plant-based. And that in combination with smoking cessation, walking, and meditation definitely had some very positive outcomes as well. Was it necessary to do the vegan diet? Was that the thing that made the difference? It's hard to say. We don't, nutrition studies are so expensive and hard to do. We don't have a lot where they've said, let's compare the Mediterranean to the completely vegan diet. So we can't say for sure if one is better than the other. But what you can say is which one fits you best, right? If someone's liking the food and they feel good on the diet, then they're going to do it for longer. And that's what makes the difference. There was one study where they looked at people in a cardiac rehab program. And at the end of the 12 weeks, about 90% were eating in a way that would be considered heart healthy. And a year later, it dropped to about 40%. So many, many people dropped out of that heart healthy zone once they had a little time between them and their heart event, which I think is good. Because a lot of times you're doing things out of fear. And that's not a nice way to live. But we want you to eat in a heart healthy way so that you feel good. It gives you energy. It supports your exercise. It boosts your mood. Because if you're doing it out of fear, it probably won't last. But anyways, liking the food helps with that.
Absolutely. And it all comes down to your sweet spot that you talk about. So
right. Yes, exactly. And if it doesn't have to be perfect, right? Always go back to that 80-20 rule. If 80% of what you're eating is healthy, it's okay if, it's not 100%. And that's much more manageable for people.
Brilliant. Well, I'd like to wrap up today. But before we do, can you let everybody know how they can find out more about your work and how they can make contact with you?
Absolutely. So probably the best place is my blog at sweetspotnutrition.ca. And I write just about every week on some practical topic. I do things like, what's good to eat at Costco and Starbucks, and, how can we lower our triglycerides was a recent one that I was surprised had a lot of traction. I guess must be lots of people having trouble with that. And then if you are just starting out with having a heart event and you want to download my ebook, that's a really good place to start with some great practical tips. And that's at sweetspotnutrition.ca/cardiac. And that's a nice little free ebook with kind of the FAQs, things people ask about, how to flavor things in a heart healthy way if you're trying to use less salt, etc. And then if you're on social media, you can always reach out to me. Usually Sweet Spot RD, Instagram, Twitter, and then Facebook. It's just, Sweet Spot Nutrition. So I'll send you the links. Yeah.
Excellent. I'll include them in the show notes so that everybody can just click through, which makes life a little bit easier. But thank you, Cheryl. It's been fabulous talking to you today.
Well, thank you for inviting me, Sally. I love what you do. It's really been to get to know you.
Thank you for listening today. It means a lot to me. I hope you got at least one takeaway from this episode. And if you're interested, you can find the show notes and any links that I've mentioned on my website. It's www.myheartandmind.co.uk/podcast. And finally, I just want to remind you, you are loved more than you will ever know. You are admired by more people than you'd ever expect. and you are worthy of joy and happiness.
You've been listening to Sally Crawley and the My Heart and Mind podcast, a show for you if you've had a heart attack, cardiac event, or other life-changing experience and want to feel good. It's all about mastering your feelings and emotions so you can feel great and live the life you love. To find out more, visit www.myheartandmind.co.uk and note that that's an AND and not the ampersand character. Go be magnificent.